Hi, and welcome to Is That Even Constitutional? So, this is a podcast where we use the lens of the Constitution to dissect current events selected from recent administration actions, headlines, listener questions, or interesting legal issues that we identify ourselves. My name is Sadhana Devaraja, and every week we will be in conversation to do a deep dive on a new topic. And so this week, folks have certainly been hearing about federal workers being laid off, and this has many underlying constitutional issues. Some we've covered through previous episodes, such as the unconstitutionality of getting rid of departments and department heads. Some we've covered in our understanding of independent agencies. We've talked about what happens if the administration defies a judicial order. And we're hoping that in future episodes we'll cover due process that's afforded by the Constitution and enshrined in some statutes. For today, we're really lucky to have a special guest, Elizabeth Aniskevich, who's a litigator and a former federal employee at the CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on today.
We're so glad you can join today because what we're hoping to cover is really a real life experience of being let go from a very important independent agency, and hoping you can give us color to, your personal story as well as the work that the agency did and a little bit of how this is playing out. So we're so grateful to have you and your time today. Could you actually tell us about the CFPB and its mission?
Yes, oh my gosh, I'd love to. So the CFPB was created in response to the financial crisis in 2008 by Elizabeth Warren. And its marching orders were basically to protect consumers. And it had authority over 18. It has, I mean, it does still exist. I shouldn't talk about it like it's gone yet. It has authority over 18 different statutes. So it from anything from unfair and deceptive practices to the Military Lending Act, to Truth in Lending Act, to Fair Credit Reporting. If you have a student loan, if you have an auto loan, if you have a mortgage, if you've ever taken out a payday loan, it's just like they have their hands in every consumer um, interaction that you've been a part of, that anyone has been a part of. And one thing I think that's so amazing about our country is always fracturing and it feels really charged right now, but we're all consumers. No one can escape being a consumer. And so it felt really good to work there and to work on behalf of everyone. It really felt that way. And in addition to the broad scope of the statutory duties that we had, or the statutes that we could oversee, we also had supervision, which I think is a really important aspect that was unique to the CFPB. Sometimes people will argue, oh, you're just like the FTC. We're not, for a variety of reasons. A very important one is the FTC doesn't have supervisory authority. So for banks with $10 billion or more in assets, or just any entity that we oversee, we can go in and supervise them, meaning we can just say, hey, what's going on? We're going to ask you about particular practices. We're going to look at documents. And then if we see trouble, we can work with you right now to try to fix that. We don't have to go into an enforcement action. We don't have to do an investigation. We don't have to go into litigation. We can communicate and try to fix whatever the issue is that the CFPB identifies. And I think that, a lot of the supervised entities that the CFPB oversaw, it was a nice relationship with each other. I mean, of course, we're the regulators. There can be some sort of tension, I guess I would say, but it was collegial and there was an understanding of what was going on. It wasn't adversarial. And in just 13 years, the CFPB recovered $21 billion for consumers, and we're not funded by taxpayer dollars. I mean, this was like a win-win-win. I don't understand. Doging us isn't going to reduce the federal budget because we're not paid by Congress. We were under the Federal Reserve, and so we're just not even a part of line item budget. So it was just like this was like a net positive for consumers. And yeah, I mean, since the stop work order, there's even been recoveries that have not been dispersed to consumers because there's just no one to do it.
Wow. Yeah. And I I've been following the CFPB, I think, since its founding 12 or 13 years ago. And just hearing all the personal stories, the real life impacts of people being able to recover, individually thousands of dollars from banks. It's not, obviously the monetary compensation is huge for folks to be able to get that back in their bank account. And also the feeling of power that it's not you, single person, versus a credit agency or a banking institution or something like that. There's someone having your back.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's so I've done class action litigation almost my entire career, and even when you have a really good settlement, the numbers of monetary recovery are not usually anywhere near what we could get for consumers at the CFPB. We would have consumers write us emails thanking us for particular outcomes and saying like one person in particular said, I was able to buy my kids Christmas presents this year because I got a check from the CFPB in the mail. And I mean, when that was read to us during enforcement week, people were visibly emotional. Like we really believed in the work that we were doing. And I think your point about not being one person up against a big entity is really important because there are issues where companies, it's not even necessarily malicious, it's just you're just one consumer, they're not going to fix the issue for you. But when you have a regulator say, hey, in mass, for example, we filed a lawsuit against Experian right before I left for issues with correcting people's credit reports. If just one person does that, Experian doesn't really pay attention. But if a regulator does it, not only do they pay attention, but there's a true ability to fix the system, to change how Experian investigates when people say, hey, this isn't right on my credit report. Experian has statutory duties to investigate in a certain way, and they don't always do them. So I think it is a real loss for consumers and going to create a real vacuum for not only that sort of lazy behavior that I'm talking about, but also outright predatory behavior.
Could you tell us a little bit about your federal government service and kind of what happened in April here?
Yeah, so I was formerly an enforcement attorney at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I started in June of 2024. And so we had a 2-year, it's called a probationary term, which means basically we have less protections than other federal employees when it comes to being removed from our position. And so in February of 2025, when Doge had entered the CFPB and started taking it over, all of us who were on probationary status were fired in an email blast, basically, late in the evening on February 11th. And 2 days later, term employees, so those were people who may have a position that is only intended to last 2 or 3 years, were also all fired in the same way. So about 200 or so of us were impacted in February. There was significant litigation after that that has sort of culminated and come to a new head as of this month, April 2025. So I can jump into that now if you want. I just want to make sure
Yeah.
if there's any other questions about the probationary stuff.
No, I think that's fascinating. One thing I understand about probationary is that, one, there's kind of a public misunderstanding about what probationary means. So I'm glad you gave that definition of 2 years or less of service. My understanding is also people who were recently promoted. So they might have been at an agency longer than 2 years, but they were 2 years within their new position that they might have been promoted for because they were doing a good job. Is that right?
It's right, but it shouldn't have been. This whole thing
Yeah.
was such a mess. There, people who came from other agencies you're not supposed to be considered a probationary employee in your new role. At the CFPB, luckily, there was no one who had come over to the CFPB from another agency and was terminated, but I've heard stories of that across many different agencies. I spoke to a woman at the USDA, who had been a government employee for almost 17 years. She started a new job, a new position within the USDA. She didn't even come over from another agency, and she was terminated as a probationary employee. So I think that's just emblematic of sort of how thoughtless this entire approach was.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And so what happened next?
So after we were terminated, the probationary employees, we immediately started rallying, and lawsuits were filed in several different forums. There were lawsuits on behalf of probationary employees specifically, and then there was also a case that we refer to former CFPB employees as the ex-essential case, which was basically to save the bureau in its entirety. And that case also included a claim to get probationary employees reinstated. And all of the initial litigation that concerned probationary employees was really saying, although we don't have the same protection as federal employees who are not probationary, we can't just be fired for no basis. There does have to be a reason that is tied to the probationary employee. And when 200 of us were fired within 15 minutes of one another via an email that gave us all the exact same reason, some of those emails were actually a failed mail merge, and it would just
Oh my
say
gosh.
brackets, insert name, bracket, insert position. So they were not individually tailored. And since we were fired in mass, what is argued in a lot of this litigation is that the administration actually performed a RIF, a reduction in force of probationary employees, but they didn't want to call it a RIF. And they thought they could get away with it because we were probationary. And the reason they wouldn't want to call it a RIF is that would require particular safeguards of notice, for example. So when we got these letters, we were fired as of that moment. I didn't get to go to work the next day and log in and get my files and wrap things up. It was just terminated as of that moment. A RIF requires notice, so you know it's coming. 60 days, you can prepare. It also generally includes severance, and you still get those things if you're RIFed as a probationary employee, but the administration thought, we'll just fire all of you probationaries en masse. We're not going to RIF you. And so that's where the initial challenges came from. That, this was basically a constructive RIF, is what a lot of the litigation said. And then the existential case with the CFPB that also asked for our reinstatement also sought many other forms of relief because there had been evidence that absent the granting of a preliminary injunction, so stopping the agency from doing anything further, that they intended to fire 90% of the agency at the end of this very same week that I was fired as a probationary employee. The CFPB also canceled all of its outstanding contracts and had deleted a lot of important information. They stopped answering the consumer complaint database, which is a really big source of information for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And they basically also, everyone was under a work stoppage. Before I was fired, the entire agency had been told, stop working. I believe that was on February 8th. And that wasn't lifted until late March under a court order.
I'm so sorry that you and your colleagues went through this. It just sounds like psychological warfare. I know I've been hearing that term from my friends who have been in federal service as well, and it's just really cruel. And especially that additional detail of like the emails and how they presented to some people, and I'm sure the confusion and uncertainty that caused is just really torturous. And also just you use the word thoughtless, and that's really cruel when we're talking about someone's employment, right? I have a lot of questions based on what you shared, and so I'm going to kind of ask a couple of them, and also want to move to other pieces. But regarding the litigation, I have maybe two questions. Who is bringing the litigation then, and then also like what legal arguments is the administration then making? You talked a little bit about the arguments that whoever's representing the laid off workers are making, but kind of what is the Trump administration making here?
Yeah, so in the CFPB's litigation, in particular, the existential case,
Hmm.
and I think there's been also some additional developments that I should maybe highlight to bring us up to where we are in April
Okay.
in that litigation in particular. So that litigation was brought by the National Treasury Employee union, NTEU, which is the union that represents many Bureau employees, as well as a few other sort of stakeholders who had an interest in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and benefited from its work. The arguments that were presented there were that the agency's actions exceeded the authority that's permitted, and that the CFPB has about 80 statutory duties that it is required to perform, and they cannot just be stopped by the agency issuing a stop work order. That the only way the Bureau can be dissolved or not be held accountable to its statutory duties is by an act of Congress changing what the CFPB it has to do. And so the judge in that case eventually did grant the PI and said, you can't just shut down the CFPB. You can't have a stop work order. You have to ensure that you have enough employees to perform your statutory duties. You have to reinstate all of your former employees that you have fired. You have to reinstate all the contracts that you've canceled, and you can't RIF anyone going forward. That was appealed to the DC Circuit, and the DC Circuit stayed the portion of the district court order that said you couldn't RIF anyone. And within 3 days, 3 business days, 1,500 of the remaining 1,700 employees at the Bureau received a RIF notice. So the very thing that we knew was going to happen absent this order, but that violated the other parts of the district court's order. The parts that said you can't do a stop work order. You can't prevent the CFPB from performing its statutory duties. And so the district court judge issued a show cause order the day that those RIFs went out. And on Friday, April 18th, she stopped the RIFs. So as of now, the Bureau, no one has been fired, but the ability to perform the work is greatly impacted by all of this stopping, starting. The Trump administration's arguments the whole time are, we can do this. It's the executive controls this agency. The president can do what he wants here. It's his prerogative. It's his policies that we are enforcing when we fire the entire Bureau. But they don't seem to understand that there are statutory duties created by Congress, and the executive cannot just fire and dissolve an entire agency absent Congress's approval of that.
Yeah, and we cover a little bit of that for listeners in previous episodes about independent agencies and what is allowable and what isn't allowable, and also the unitary executive theory by which it seems like a lot of this is happening. And also a little bit in your answer about, kind of defying judicial orders and how that seems to be part of the pattern here. So I appreciate you pulling those pieces up. Was your job protected by law? You talk a little bit about the process of RIFs and what notice is supposed to be given. What did it look like, even despite the RIFs? Were there protections in place for the probationary worker?
Yeah, so for probationary workers, there still has to be an individualized reason that I'm being fired. It can't be pretextual. So the termination letter I received basically said, we've determined that your needs no longer, or that your knowledge, skills, and ability no longer align with the agency's mission and purpose. And that is pretextual. It's just not accurate. I was very committed to the cause, as were all of my colleagues. We all received the exact same explanation, and many of us had received glowing reviews, months before we were terminated. And so we could not be fired for pretextual reasons. There had to be a real reason. It could be, we've determined that we just don't want you, but it would have to be tied to me specifically. As for all of my other colleagues, though, who were RIFed later, who were not probationary employees, they have even more rights than I do. And so they were required to receive the notice that they did receive when they were riffed. They were given 60 days notice and they were given severance. But where the administration messed up there and went beyond their authority is that they received a notice saying you are riffed. In 60 days, you will no longer be employed. But as of 6 p.m. tomorrow, you can't access any of your work portals. You cannot work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think in practice or on the surface, sure, they've complied with the RIF guidelines there, but they've also violated the court's order by imposing a work stoppage when you can't. And the statutory issue that we've been talking about, where now the agency is unable to complete its statutory duties because Congress um, hasn't said you can have nobody working here. So
Yeah.
the employees who were just recently ripped, a protection that they have now, and we did have too as probationaries, is you can appeal the decision of the agency to the Merit Protection System Board.
Okay. So, and my understanding is like if they had gone through this different way, like if they had gotten the agency head on board, agency heads can eliminate federal jobs in the way that you're describing, right? Using that process.
Yeah, that is right. And our agency head did order this, but there's also an interesting thing going on there. I mean, I know I'm talking so much about the CFPB specifically, but we only have an acting director now who is Russell Vought, who has specifically said he intends to traumatize federal workers.
Oh, wow.
He's also the head of the Office of Budget Management. He's in a dual-hatted role right now. There has been a nominee that has been that we're just waiting for his confirmation to lead the CFPB. But I think the intent here is to keep him on the sidelines while Russell Vought destroys the agency. In McCarran, that's the person who's been nominated to take over the CFPB. In his confirmation hearing, Elizabeth Warren said, "You look like the first horse at the glue factory." And he said, "No, we're going to keep this agency running." And during his confirmation hearing, I think 5 enforcement actions were just dropped during that hearing. So the head of the agency is ordering these rifts, but he's not the real head. I don't know how to say that. I mean, he's an
Yeah.
acting director.
And I didn't realize that Russell Vought was acting director of the CFPB. So that's interesting color to this story as well, given his background, of course, the OMB dual hat. So, what kind of impacts is this having on federal employees nationwide? What are you seeing?
I think it's been, I mean, in addition to the psychological warfare that you've been talking about, I think it's just really demoralizing and confusing. And, people I can say specifically at my job and other federal employees I've spoken to at other agencies, you're not given any notice about your benefits. You don't know when your health insurance is going to end. Even if your health insurance wasn't supposed to end, many people are having health insurance claims denied because the agency hadn't communicated with the health insurer that there should be an extension of your benefits. We weren't given forms to file for unemployment for weeks. DC would process some claims without those forms. Other states, you couldn't even apply. So people couldn't even get health insurance or unemployment to fill the gap. And, I think that people who have not been riffed or have not been fired yet, I think that they're impacted by this as well because nobody really feels safe at their agency now. So I think we're kind of looking at a mass exodus of civil servants who have served under administrations, Democratic, Republican, who are really there just to do their job, fleeing because they no longer feel that they're safe. And that worries me because it sort of opens the vacuum to return to a spoil system where we're packing all agencies with loyalists to whoever the president is at any given moment.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I also to add color to the timeline kind of unemployment benefits and things like that that you mentioned. I know that for some of my friends who are federal workers, even the folks who are supposed to be like approving kind of the unemployment benefits at their agency have been let go. And so now there's like, who is this going to? And so that like delay is not only like a delay that feels interminable, there's like no answer to like how it will be resolved and kind of nowhere to go. And so I think that is definitely real when they have themselves and families to care for. And your point about kind of the knock-on effects of both like the federal workforce and what that's going to look like if it's not a place of stability. I know that for myself and for others who worked in the federal government, it was the pay usually wasn't competitive to private sector, but you had the stability, right? And you were doing service and you had the mission, and removing those things makes it a much tougher argument.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think related to that, so many people that in my world, they were attorneys who had just graduated law school and were going into an honors program, not only at CFPB, but across the government, which those are prestigious positions, are hard to get. We would hire at the CFPB 4 or 5 attorneys, and we would have 500 applicants for those positions. All of them, they lost. Those programs don't exist right now. And so you have people who are, fresh out of school. Similar programs exist for new college grads. It's a great tool to recruit people into the federal government. And now I think this could have really lasting impacts for generations to come of, is it safe to leave, to put my eggs in this basket when I'm just graduating and to join the federal workforce? And I think, one thing that has maybe some constitutional layers to it, or at least is worth discussing here, is when you were asking me about the rights that people have when they're fired, and how you can appeal to the Merit System Protection Board. Even that's 3 people who run that board. Trump has fired one of those, and that has gone through basically the same sort of litigation that all of us probationary employees have gone through. It was stopped at the district court level, appealed to the DC circuit. They stayed the undoing of her firing. And then another panel of the DC circuit said, no, you can't, we're unstaying the stay of the firing. You can go back to work. But all of this is to say a 3-commission board who is then inundated with employees appealing their firing right now is hamstrung. There's only 2 people running a 3-commission board. One has also indicated that they intend to retire soon. And so it's just even government employees who might have the appetite to stay and appeal, it's just not a realistic timeline for them.
Yeah, that I'm glad you pulled up on that. I had no idea that was happening with that entity. And I think like the other part of what you mentioned, it's not just the impacts on like newly entering folks, like these like attorneys that are probably the cream of the crop nationally. It's also the institutional history that sounds like is being lost through the rifts, right? So then if I know people talk about like what happens after, and how do we rebuild, or things like that. It's going to be a very different situation already with the loss of the institutional history and memory.
Yeah, it's like destroying something can happen so fast, but rebuilding is not as quick as destruction. And that particularly, obviously, I'm very connected to the CFPB. I mean, I really loved working there, and it was an amazing institution. And I would think when I was there, I mean, I really loved it. I cannot believe this place has just been stood up in 12, 13 years. Like, it was incredible to me. It was a relatively new agency, and it's definitely in its infancy compared to the vast majority of other agencies, but there was so much knowledge and commitment and such an interesting way that the parts of the Bureau work together, and just rebuilding all of that and re-implementing all of that. And that's just the agency I have insight into. I can't imagine, I mean, how to even do it. I hope that we have the opportunity to, not just the CFPB, we, the collective, have an opportunity to rebuild all of our agencies that are being impacted by these actions. But it feels hard to know how we're going to do that and how long it will take.
So, I think we're about to close here. You really covered a lot about what's happening. What the CFPB is. So, what's happening, been happening at the CFPB since February. The terminations, the reductions in force, the litigation that's ongoing, and kind of the psychological impacts. Do you want to kind of have a last word here? Is there anything we didn't cover, or kind of how you would sum this up?
Yeah, I think the only other thing, it's not necessarily related to the RIFs or the CFPB, but another thing that just generally is going on with the federal workforce that I think is important to make people aware of is that Trump has been reclassifying a lot of federal workers as Schedule F workers,
Mhm.
which strips them of like any of these protections that we've been talking about, because you're sort of like a policy person who you're not necessarily, I don't believe like an actual political appointee. I don't think the president has to appoint every single one of those people, but yet you're not seen as like a permanent government employee. And so he tried to do this in his first administration, and the election occurred. And so he didn't get to totally get it through. And then there were efforts to sort of forestall the impacts of this in a second administration, which have, I don't know how much they're going to matter. And so I think, just like sort of if we like zoom out with what's happening, is that probationary employees basically at all agencies were terminated immediately without the limited rights that we were entitled to. People who do have the rights are being riffed in really scattershot ways. And then I think going forward, the people who remain will either be classified as Schedule F, or coming in, they'll become a Schedule F employee. And we're just going to pack, the system with loyalists. And that's troubling to me, not only because of this particular administration, but I think, it's interesting to me that this administration doesn't have the foresight to see that hopefully it's not always a Trump president. And so there's a whole reason that we have a civil service that is independent. We're not allowed to talk about who we vote for in our capacity as a civil servant. That's not allowed. And so there's been an effort for 200 or so years to make sure that the civil service isn't a loyalist to whoever's in the White House. And I think, fortunately, we have an administration that their very goal is to make everyone who works for the federal government be a loyalist. And so it's scary.
Yeah. And I think I appreciate you pulling up on how, earlier we talked about the value proposition of a civil service job includes like the mission, but also stability. And, some of the procedures that provide that stability can take time, but, that's part of the value proposition of being a federal employee. And now I think pulling up to the value proposition of being in this country and being a part of this country is the stability of the government. And so it's not just on this like individual employee level, but the destabilizing form of the government just really throws into question kind of the value proposition of the country as a whole. So appreciate
Yeah.
you pulling up on that. Thank you so
Just a
much,
minor
Elizabeth.
question. You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
This was great. I loved getting to chat with you today, despite the circumstances, and I am hopeful for your future and for all of the good work you'll continue to do, personally knowing you and for other folks as well. So thanks for taking time today.
Yeah. Thank you so much.